Welcome to the Rights Track podcast, which gets the hard facts about the human rights challenges facing us today. In Series 6, we're asking if and how our human rights are threatened by the Covid-19 pandemic. I'm Todd. In today's episode, I'm delighted to be joined by Tom Parker, a prominent counter-terrorism practitioner who has consulted for the EU, the United Nations, Amnesty International, and MI5 on post-conflict justice, security sector reform, and counter-terrorism. He's author of a new book, Avoiding the Terrorist Trap: Why Respect for Human Rights is the Key to Defeating Terrorism. Today, Tom is here to talk to us about the complex interplay between counterterrorism and human rights. And together, we'll be reflecting on how and if the COVID-19 pandemic has had an impact on these things directly or indirectly. So, Tom, welcome to the Rights Track, and you're joining us from Abuja. So it's a real pleasure to have you here to talk to us. And I suppose my first question is, in your book, you make this very strong case that there's no one set profile of a terrorist, that there's a multiplicity of actors and incredible networks of actors that fall under the general category of being a terrorist. But to actually say there's a profile of a typical terrorist is just, a fool's errand. There's no such thing. And I wonder if you could just comment on that.
Well, Todd, thanks so much for inviting me to take part in this podcast. You're absolutely right. And this is a really important point. There have been many, many attempts to try and come up with some sort of predictive profile of the kind of individual who becomes involved in terrorist movements. And over the past 20 years, all of those efforts have really led us to this very clear realization that there simply isn't a profile. There are rich and there are poor terrorists. There are well-educated and poorly educated terrorists. There are young and old terrorists. There are men and women who play active roles in terrorist organizations. There are brothers. Mohamed Merah, the gunman who killed several Jewish school children in Toulouse and shot a French paratrooper, he went in one direction. His brother married a Jewish woman and is involved in interfaith dialogue groups. They grew up in the same household, in the same family, exposed to the same influences in the same neighborhoods, but their lives went in very different paths. So I think this is a really important point to understand. There are societal pressures that push people towards terrorism. There are community pressures that push people towards terrorism. There are social pressures. And there are those internal processes as well that might lead somebody to look favorably on joining a terrorist group. Sometimes we describe it as the quest for significance. Sometimes it's referred to as the Hemingway effect, or the quest for self-actualization. But there are all these different processes that come together in a context that act on each individual in an individual way. And it does make it incredibly difficult to predict who will or will not become a terrorist, which doesn't mean that there aren't certain behaviors on society's part that might indicate whether or not terrorism is more likely to emerge in a society. If you marginalize people, if you deprive them of political opportunities, probably the most highly correlated factor is physical abuse and human rights abuses. You may push people towards violence because in the words of Leon Trotsky, there's no other way out. They have no other choice. But it's never going to be all the people. Terrorism is always a minority activity. The people who actually become active terrorists, they're all a fraction of a fraction, the fringe of the fringe. So it's never the mainstream option, which tells us that the vast majority of people exposed to the kind of influences that push people towards terrorism don't actually become violent.
So that's a great portrait. I mean, in the sense that it's this incredible complexity, the heterogeneity of the group from one extreme to the other, and from different faiths, from different socioeconomic backgrounds. And you've also mapped out from a social science perspective the sort of rational, cultural, and structural reasons and motivations for why people commit terrorist acts. But rather counterintuitively in the book, at least from a lay reader might read the book and think, why is he emphasizing the importance of human rights? And the one thing you focus on is you say, look, despite all this difference across terrorists, they're human beings. So what is it about the human rights frame or a human rights-based approach to combating terror that's so important to you?
One of the things that I tried to do in my book was to take a really long, in-depth look at what terrorists around the world say about what they're trying to achieve by using terrorism as a tool, as a political vehicle to achieve their objectives. One thing that became quite clear to me as I read articles, pamphlets, manuals, interviews, memoirs written by different terrorists from, as I say, 4 or 5 different continents over about a period of 150 years, if we say terrorism is a phenomenon that really emerges in the the second half of the 19th century, there is a consistent doctrine of operations that you will find pretty much every single terrorist group adheres to. And that doctrine had, to my mind, I identify 6 core principles. The principle of asymmetrical warfare, the principle of attrition, also known as the long war, the concept of propaganda by deed, of spreading your message through your actions, the idea of a revolutionary prototype, sort of charismatic leadership, martyrdom you might call it. But the 2 that I was really interested in from the perspective that I take in this book is the idea that you seek to provoke an overreaction from the government that you are opposing, and that you try and undermine that government's legitimacy while building the legitimacy of your own movement. And those are the 2 things where our human rights framework really becomes very significant. Because if you respond to terrorism within that human rights framework, you're less likely to fall into the trap that each terrorist group basically sets for its opponents, which is this overreaction, to polarize society, to behave in a way that strips, as Baader-Meinhof would have referred to it, as stripping the mask from the state, exposing the sort of fascist tendencies of the state underneath. Now, of course, with the Red Army faction, there was that German context. We're talking 20 years after Nazi Germany, so there was a very specific Nazi context there that they were trying to expose, this idea that a lot of Hitler's successors had drifted back into the woodwork and were still involved in German society. That was one of their sort of articles of faith. But this basic idea that, the state is actually, it's not the nanny state, it's not the comforting liberal institution that particularly democratic states like to project, and that if you can rip that mask away, you'll see the real enforcement, harsher organization, more self-interested organization underneath. This idea is hardwired into terrorism. And this idea of trying to prod and provoke the state to carry out acts such as torture or beating up a demonstration, firing on a crowd, that kind of thing, this is the outcome that terrorists are trying to achieve.
And so it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way then.
Exactly so. And in fact, Martha Crenshaw, who's one of the sort of doyens of terrorism research, is an expert on the Algerian War of Independence. She refers to the Algerians and used to refer to the conflict as the engagement of gears. This idea that once you can get the other side engaged, your gear turns their gear.
Thanks, Tom. You mentioned this idea of the liberal democratic state, and I just want to focus very closely on that notion. After 9/11, there was a real consolidation of anti-terror legislation across liberal democracies. There was a variation in response to terrorism. But generally speaking, this was fueled by the idea that somehow open societies were more susceptible to terrorist attacks. Therefore, there's something inherently wrong with an open society. And therefore, those open societies should put more controls in place, and they should rescind from their rights commitments in ways that close down freedom of expression, freedom of association, and other liberties that we're used to exercising within liberal democratic frameworks. And I wonder if you could just comment on that closing in of the liberal democratic state. And then, of course, the counterproductive result of that closing in produces the very things that those states are trying to prevent.
Yeah, I think the first thing to say is that terrorism is essentially a tool that we see being used against democracies, partly because there is that sense of restraint. You don't see terrorism in authoritarian societies because, of course, the state is unrestrained in the way it responds. And you may see opposition to that authoritarian state, but it can be tamped down, and it can be tamped down until typically there is some sort of revolutionary explosion, or perhaps that state gets into a conflict with another state and is weakened that way. And you would see that with, say, the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany. But within democracies, what terrorists are usually trying to do is to reach or push the state towards a political settlement. So they're trying to basically open a political dialogue. They're just using it through violence. So that's one part of why terrorism tends to flourish in democracies. Another thing that's important to say is human rights law doesn't prevent states from taking actions to protect themselves from terrorism. In many ways, international human rights law is quite permissive in the techniques that it allows states to use. You can bug, you can surveil, you can intercept communications, you can run agents, you can use force, and you can detain people within the context of a human rights framework. You just have to do it lawfully, proportionately, to the extent that it's necessary and no more, and always seek to get back to the status quo ante of full rights observance. If you stay within that basic framework, there's an awful lot you can do to protect yourself. I don't really understand why you would need or want to step beyond that framework to achieve your goals. As a security service officer in the UK back in the 1990s, I can't remember any case I worked on where I did not have access to the tools I needed to do the job within the legal context, the law of the land in the UK. We had a wide range of tools. They were lawful tools, and they could be applied lawfully to achieve the objectives to prevent attacks. So that I think the assumption that human rights gets in the way of effective counterterrorism and somehow ties the hands of the state, which is a phrase you often hear, that the state has to fight with one hand tied behind its back. That's actually a false assumption that doesn't really hold water. I don't think there's actually a tension between effective counterterrorism and human rights observance.
And that's a really interesting answer. And I wonder if I just push that a little bit, because a lot of people have constructed terrorism as a truly existential threat of the kind like a natural disaster or a full declaration of war. And under human rights law, if the state determines it is under an existential threat, it can begin to derogate from its international human rights commitments. So things like free speech could be curbed under an emergency law for a short period of time. And then, of course, those rights could be protected again after the period of crisis is over. How much of terrorism is being constructed today as a notion of existential threat to justify the curbing of human rights?
I think terrorism does pose an existential threat, just not in the sense that's usually meant. The existential threat is in that real sense of the term existential. The threat is how we respond to terrorism. Terrorism at best, and the most famous analogy about terrorism is it's the war of the flea, a concept that Mao Zedong first sort of introduced in his book on guerrilla warfare. But people often refer to the war of the flea, but they don't really quite understand or fully process what Mao said. What Mao says is that the flea bites the dog. The flea gets onto the dog, it bites the dog, but it's not the flea bites that incapacitate the dog. It's the way that the dog scratches at the bites and the way that those scratches get infected. That is what Mao says incapacitates the dog, i.e. it's the dog's reaction, not the flea bites, that poses the real existential threat. Terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda never posed an existential threat to the United States, in the sense that Al-Qaeda could have invaded the United States, overthrown its system of government and imposed Sharia law across the entire territory of contiguous North America, right? That was never the threat posed by Al-Qaeda. The number of people killed by Al-Qaeda out of a population of 350 million people was infinitesimal, while tremendously significant, obviously, if you're one of the families caught up in it, in terms of the total death toll, including 9/11 through to the current time. You're talking about somewhere around 3,100, 3,200 people in the United States killed by terrorism over a 20-year period. So, compared to other threats, like car accidents or for that matter, COVID, the number of deaths is really quite small when seen in the full sort of context of other threats to human life in that period.
That relativization is really important. And the other observation, at least on the data analysis of terrorism, is that large-scale terrorist attacks are relatively infrequent, partly because of the coordination, information sharing, and real logistics of carrying out a successful large-scale terrorist attack means that these are going to be infrequent events, and yet we find legislation passed that has longer duration than maybe is required for the infrequency of those attacks.
Right, and we see things like a lot of laws passed after 9/11 are still enforced today. I quite like the old system that we had in the UK with the Prevention of Terrorism Act that had to be renewed every 2 years. And this idea throughout the Northern Ireland conflict in the UK was that terrorism was an aberration, and that we would, work to get back to the status quo ante as soon as possible. Hence, all of our terrorism legislation up until the Terrorism Act 2000 was temporary in nature and had to be renewed periodically by the Commons, which really reinforced to us that this is an exceptional state of affairs that we will revert back to a norm from at some point in time. I think that's really, really important. And we've kind of lost that sense since 9/11, both in the UK and the United States, and I think in Europe in general. We've built a security architecture that isn't really and probably never was intended to be temporary. And we've done it at a time, which alarms me a little bit, that the technology is now so sufficiently advanced that this security architecture can be really quite intrusive in a way that was technically and physically impossible 20 years ago. That intrusiveness may make it very, very hard to dismantle.
Absolutely. And the other thing I wanted to pick up on is you use this idea of the war of the flea and really focused on the reaction of the flea-bitten dog, if you will. And in that, you made a direct reference to COVID. So if we could turn our conversation around a little bit to COVID and maybe stretch our analogies a bit, COVID could be conceived as an existential threat. It's a silent killer. It doesn't discriminate. It races through societies. It has had a disproportionate effect. We've learned on the Rights Track this series to different groups, particularly marginalized groups, ethnic minority groups, et cetera. But I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about, COVID as conceived of as an existential threat, because at the moment, terrorism is almost receded from the popular imagination, that everyone's focused on COVID. What are your views about the state response to COVID as an existential threat?
I think there's a couple of different interesting ideas in all of this. One of them is the concept of privilege. COVID seems like an existential threat in the West, perhaps, largely because there aren't other similar diseases that pose a like threat. As you mentioned at the top of the show, I live in Nigeria, where we have a number of health threats when we step outside our doors, then the principal of which is malaria. Everybody in the area that I work in at some point gets malaria. There's not a lot you can do to avoid it, and it can be very, very serious indeed when you get it. So you'll see not many people in Nigeria taking COVID, quite as seriously as a lot of people do, obviously, in the West. Because there's a landscape of serious threats, of which COVID is only one here in Nigeria. It assumes greater significance perhaps in the UK because there isn't quite the same landscape of threats. So I think that's one thing to think about. International human rights law does consistently anticipate that you may have to curtail freedoms out of a concern for public health. That's hardwired into the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and through other international human rights instruments. So there isn't per se a threat to human rights in measures taken to protect public health. Again, so long as, and it's actually the same rubric, so long as the measures taken, just like the measures taken to protect the public from terrorism, are lawful and reasonable and proportionate and necessary to prevent the harm that you're seeking to avoid.
And we've seen massive debates in the US and UK precisely on that point, right? So the sort of permanency of anti-terror legislation, the buildup of security apparatus and institutions, and the ability for governments to take away freedoms, we've seen that certainly the researchers at Oxford University have produced what they call a stringency index for all countries in the world as in their response to COVID. And their indicators look very similar to the types of human rights indicators we've been using for years. And stringency has gone up. And then as the pandemic recedes, stringency comes back down. And I wonder, and I think people fear that, how many of these sort of measures will remain permanent, how many of them were temporary, and what's going to happen, this autumn. We see a Delta variant, we see a Lambda variant, we see the Freedom Day in the UK is announced as the 19th of July, and yet COVID is going to still be with us. So this idea of we have to live with COVID, we also have to live with terrorism. And I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Well, there's a concept in political science called the iron law of bureaucracy, one of the few consistently tested laws in political science that has yet to be disproven. And the idea there is basically once you establish a bureaucracy, it will seek to strengthen and enlarge itself. There are very few bureaucracies that shrink. And once you establish something, once you build a wall, it's very difficult to take it down. Once you invest in putting cameras on street corners, they stay up. And I think that's one of the things that we don't think enough about at the outset of whether it's a public health crisis or a national security crisis. We will likely live with the measures that are put in for a very long period of time. The shoe bomber, Richard Reed, in the mid-2000s, if I remember correctly, we still take our shoes off at airports every single time we get on an airplane. One person tried unsuccessfully once to smuggle a bomb in a shoe onto a plane. And typically in the terrorism business, if you try something and it doesn't work, you move on to another tactic. As indeed AQAP and Al Qaeda did, including the use of putting bombs in freight and actually putting bombs in, inserting bombs into body cavities. But we're still dutifully taking off our shoes to this day. And one of the reasons for that is no politician wants to be the person that takes responsibility for saying, it's okay, everybody, you don't have to take your shoes off anymore. And then 3 days later, there's a shoe bomb, because that's the end of their political career. So what happens is you get these things put in place that just stay around years, even decades after their utility has evaporated. I always often think about remember the ring of steel that was put around the city of London during the IRA mainland bombing campaign in the 1990s. That dwindled and dwindled and dwindled. But if you go to the city of London today, and it's been a couple of years now since I was in the city, but you could still see the remnants of those police checkpoints. It was almost like watching a slow motion film of erosion. You know, it starts off with a very significant barrier with armed police, and then it's a less significant barrier, then the police disappear, but the barrier remains, and then slowly the barrier gets smaller and smaller. But you can still see most of the entry points where the barriers are in the City of London, because it's really hard to get rid of these things and dismantle them completely. And now with the technology that we have, particularly things like facial recognition software and the computing power to process huge amounts of data that's collected by smart cameras. And I don't think we're quite at that dystopian future yet, but we're not maybe more than a decade away. We've seen China and other countries trialing concepts like smart cities with cameras that have these analytical capabilities, built into the public arena, but also linked to things like social credit and behavior and criminality. You can imagine very easily a society in 10 or 20 years' time where you're being surveilled passively wherever you go. And if the state has an issue with you, it would be very easy for that state to track you. Even in the UK, we have, the automatic license plate recognition system that most police cars have in them now. And, when a police car is traveling around in the UK, it's scanning, if it's got the equipment, it's scanning license plates coming towards it passively. And it's running those license plates against databases to see if there's an alert for that plate. Well, it's not that far off that we'll be able to do that with faces. And then the world starts to become a very, very small place indeed. And that genuinely free public space is just going to shrink and shrink, particularly in cities. And I have heard talk of that being used also to measure things like temperature. And as a tool that would actually help monitoring, public gatherings from a COVID perspective, the alert police when 30 or 40 people are gathered together too closely in a space. Well, that could also be used to warn, political police when a demonstration's gathering. So you can see how these technologies could very easily be exploited for nefarious purposes.
Of course. So that advance of technology and the dual use of technology it should be a concern for all of us, not just human rights scholars and practitioners. And I suppose my final question, just to kind of bring this back a bit to where we started, is, if I gave you a crystal ball and let's say the Delta variant, the Lambda variant disappear by Christmas time, we really have, let this thing run through society, and let's say COVID disappears until the next pandemic comes. What role for terrorism? So is our attention going to return to terrorism? Is it going to be, public enemy number one again? Or do you think there's going to be some learnings from the COVID experience that we can then bring across to the understanding terrorism and preventing terrorism? Or are these just going to be separate policy issues? Because you've drawn so many parallels between the state response in both cases. I'm just curious about your thoughts to the future. Let's say the pandemic goes away. Does terrorism come back as public enemy number one?
Well, terrorism's not gone away. Public focus might have left it, but if anything, I would have said certainly in the last 5 years, threats have been multiplying, particularly threats from right-wing extremism and racially and ethnically motivated terrorism. I mean, that's clearly on the rise and becoming a much more significant threat, and of course a much harder threat for us to root out in our society, since it is it's an internal threat. It's not an external threat for the most part. So I don't think terrorism has gone away particularly. Islamist terrorism is still a significant problem around the world. ISIS is not defeated, and is likely, I think, to experience a resurgence in across North Africa and Central Africa, and even to a certain extent now Southern Africa. We've seen in Mozambique a rise of Islamist extremism throughout the continent, where 15 years ago, 10 years ago, there was almost no extremist terrorism on the African continent. Latin America's been relatively quiet, but one could see with economic downturns resulting from COVID, there was a lot of talk earlier in the year about the possibility of the emergence or re-emergence of left-wing terrorism, which we haven't seen for a number of years, for decades even. So I think there's quite a lot of ways in which terrorism could come surging back once COVID is gone. I think COVID has probably had a slightly depressing effect or mitigating effect on terrorism, because there aren't as many targets around. It's not as easy for terrorists to move around in these COVID times with lockdowns and so forth. So there I think has been a slight reduction in the terrorist threat because of COVID, but I don't think the underlying reasons why these terrorist threats exist have disappeared. And so they are likely to reemerge from the pandemic as significant a threat as they were before.
That's a really measured answer, Tom. And nevertheless, the argument of the book sticks, which is unless we embrace a human rights-based approach to countering that threat, we're just going to repeat the mistakes of the past. So I guess my final question, and getting a sense of wrap up that, despite everything that's happened with COVID, you're sticking to the claim that a human rights-based approach is far superior to one that doesn't embrace rights.
Oh, absolutely. Counter-terrorism is hard. It's really, really hard. Public health is hard. There are always going to be strong dissenting voices to any sensible public policy that you propose, and there'll be strong dissenting voices to bad public policy that's proposed. There's always going to be contention and disagreement. But the beauty of a human rights-based approach is it is designed specifically to resist the goals that the terrorist organizations are seeking to achieve. There's a great description of terrorism as political jiu-jitsu, right? It is designed to use the state's strength against it. And human rights are designed to stay, contain, and measure state strength. So, it is designed, it's almost purpose-built to ensure a more effective response to terrorism than the more muscular, no doubt satisfying from some perspectives, this idea that we can fight, we can punch, we can push people into submission. But the reality is that's actually very, very difficult. Terrorists tend to be very strongly motivated and quite dedicated people in their way, and they're not easily intimidated. And they want that reaction. Terrorism is all about the reaction. Human rights ensures a much more measured, much more focused and more carefully targeted approach to solving the problem. And so, no, I have not changed my mind about that.
Tom Parker, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. I feel like I should take my shoes off, put my mask on, and go find some flea repellent after that very long and wide-ranging discussion, full of analogies and metaphors, but also full of deep insights from your perspective about why a human rights frame matters for combating terrorism. So for now, thank you very much for joining us on this episode of The Rights Track.
Thank you, Todd. It's been my pleasure.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Rights Track, which was presented by Todd Landman and produced by Chris Garrington of Research Podcasts. You can find out more about the podcast at www.rightstrack.org. Funding for this series comes from the Economic and Social Research Council. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast to access all forthcoming episodes and our fantastic back catalogue of 5 series of sound evidence on human rights.